I joked about stealing my best friend's sister for a date at his engagement party. I'd been staring at her for 10 years without permission. She set down her champagne, looked at me, and said, "Finally." Then she grabbed her coat. The room fell silent, the kind of silence you get before a happy family discovers it has a secret. My name is Liam, and I knew in that moment the joke had never been a joke. Not to her, not to me, not ever. For 10 years, I hid the fact that I was in love with my best friend's sister Nora. The engagement party was supposed to be another night of jokes, but when she grabbed her coat, everyone realized they'd misread the script. I wasn't harmless. I was just a liar. And in that silence, I had to decide. Let the lie crumble or finally confess a truth I'd buried since junior prom. The engagement party was at Aaron's parents' house, a restored Victorian with too many rooms and not enough air. I'd been there 100 times. I knew which floorboard creaked outside the kitchen, which bathroom had the finicky lock, which corner of the porch blocked the wind so you could smoke without Mrs. Calloway smelling it. I'd grown up in that house almost as much as Aaron had, which is how I also grew up watching Nora. She was 2 years younger. When we were kids, that gap felt like a canyon. When we were teenagers, it felt like a rule. I met Aaron in 7th grade after he'd punched a kid who stole my lunch money, not because we were friends, but because he thought the kid's technique was sloppy. We've been brothers ever since, which meant Nora was off limits. That word got tattooed into my brain before I even understood why it hurt. Junior prom was the first time I felt it calcify into a concrete mistake. I was 17, Nora was 15 and not allowed to go yet, but she'd helped Aaron's mom decorate the gym as a favor. She wore jeans and a paint-splattered t-shirt, her hair tied up in a way that showed the curve of her neck. I had a date, Megan from biology, but I couldn't stop tracking Nora across the room. She caught me once, smiled, and waved. I waved back and felt like a counterfeit. That night I drove Megan home, kissed her goodnight, and thought about Nora's smile until the sun came up. I never told Aaron. I never told anyone. I made a joke out of it instead. For a decade, every family barbecue, every holiday, every game night, I'd say something stupid to cover the fact that I was cataloging her. "Nora, if you keep baking like that, I'm going to have to marry you purely for the pies." Everyone laughed. She'd roll her eyes. Aaron would shove me, harmless. Standard guy who practically lives at your house banter. And every time I said it, the lie calcified a little more. I dated other women. I even loved some of them. But none of them stuck. None of them were her. So when Aaron got engaged to Caitlin and asked me to be his best man, I said yes the only way you can, with a speech already half written in my head and a private funeral for feelings I'd never allowed to live. The engagement party was the first public celebration. Champagne, catered appetizers, both families crammed into the living room in nice clothes, pretending they didn't already know everything about each other. I was standing near the fireplace when I saw Nora by the dessert table. She was 26 now, a graphic designer with her own apartment, her own life, and the kind of quiet confidence that had replaced teenage shyness. She held a champagne flute like it had personally let her down, and I made the joke. Not because I planned it, because the alternative was standing in a room full of people with my heart cracking through my ribs. "Nora, if you're that bored, I'll steal you away right now. We'll grab tacos and let Aaron give his speech to the cake." She didn't laugh. She didn't roll her eyes. She set the glass down with a finality that stopped my breath. Then she looked at me, really looked, the way someone looks at a locked door they've finally decided to open, and said, "Finally." Like she'd been waiting since that junior prom when I took someone else and buried the truth so deep I almost convinced myself it wasn't there. Aaron froze mid-toast, his champagne raised, his mouth still forming the next syllable. The room dropped into a silence so complete I could hear the ice melting in someone's glass. And in that silence, I watched Nora Calloway grab her coat from the back of a chair, walk toward me, and change every line I'd ever drawn between us. For one long second, no one breathed. The champagne in Aaron's glass tilted dangerously as his hand forgot to hold it steady. I could see the mechanics of his brain trying to parse what had just happened. His little sister, his best friend, a joke, a coat, a word that carried more weight than the entire toast he'd been rehearsing for a week. Nora didn't look at anyone else. She walked toward me with the kind of certainty you only develop after years of watching someone pretend you don't exist. Her coat hung over her arm, and her face was calm in a way that scared me more than anger ever could. She stopped inches away, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of perfume, something floral, something new. "You've been telling that joke since I was 16, she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. Tacos, pizza, a movie, whatever excuse you could find to say you'd steal me and then never follow through. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. So here's your chance, Liam. Was it ever real? Or am I just the punchline you're too comfortable to give up? The question landed in my chest like a stone. The room behind her was still frozen, 40 people in evening wear, watching a decade of denial collapse in real time. I saw Aaron's jaw tighten, his best man speech abandoned on a napkin near the cake. I saw Mrs. Calloway's hand fly to her mouth. I saw Caitlin, Aaron's fiancée, grab his arm like she was steadying a ship in a storm. And I saw Nora, waiting for an answer I'd been too afraid to give since I was 17 years old and too stupid to know that silence is its own kind of betrayal. "Yes," I said. The word came out cracked and raw, but it was the truest thing I'd ever spoken. It was never a joke, not once. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief, relief would have been easy. This was deeper, the look of someone who'd spent years bracing for a blow that finally landed and discovered it wasn't a blow at all. She reached up and tugged the sleeve of my jacket, a small, almost casual gesture that said more than any grand declaration ever could. "Then let's go get tacos," she said. "Aaron can give his speech to the cake." She was using my own line against me, and I would have laughed if there'd been any air left in the room. As it was, I just nodded. She turned toward the door, and I followed. That was when Aaron found his voice. "Liam." Not a shout, not a question. My name spoken like a warning shot across the bow of a friendship that had survived fistfights, bad breakups, and one unfortunate incident involving a borrowed car and a fire hydrant. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob and looked back at him. His face was unreadable, the same expression he'd worn as a kid when something surprised him, and he was still deciding whether to throw a punch or laugh it off. His parents stared at us, the party guests stared at us, and somewhere in the kitchen a caterer dropped a tray of canapés and nobody even flinched. "I'll be back," I said. "We need to talk, but not here." Nora was already at the end of the driveway, her silhouette sharp against the streetlights. I didn't wait for Aaron's response. I couldn't. If I'd stayed one more second in that room, I would have folded, and I was done folding. Outside, the October air hit my face like a splash of cold water. Nora was leaning against her car, arms crossed, watching me approach with an expression I couldn't fully read, half challenge, half something softer. She didn't speak right away. Neither did I for a moment. We just stood there on the sidewalk, two people who'd orbited each other for 10 years finally standing still at the center of the gravity we'd always pretended didn't exist. "I'm sorry," I said eventually, "for every joke. Every time I made you the punchline instead of telling you the truth." She tilted her head. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Her voice wasn't angry. It was genuinely curious, like she'd spent years running simulations in her head, and none of them produced a satisfying answer. I shoved my hands into my pockets and looked at the pavement. "Because you're Aaron's sister. Because I met him before I really met you. Because by the time I realized what I felt, the rule was already written in permanent marker and I didn't know how to rewrite it without losing him." I paused. "And because I was a coward." Nora let that hang in the air. Then she nodded slowly. "That's the first completely honest thing you've ever said to me." "I know. I've been waiting for it since junior prom." The mention of prom hit me like a physical blow. I looked up and she was smiling. Not the polite, guarded smile I'd seen her deploy at 100 family functions, but something real and slightly crooked and devastatingly familiar. "You remember," I said. "Of course I remember. You took Megan Lind home. She wore a blue dress with sequins. You danced with her to some terrible slow song, and the whole time I sat by the punch bowl wishing I was old enough to be there for real instead of as the freshman who helped with balloons." I stared at her. "We're 15. I was also in love with you." She said it plainly, like she was discussing the weather. "I thought it was obvious. My mom figured it out by the time I was 17. Aaron figured it out around 21 and told me to get over it because you were his friend and it would be weird. My stomach dropped. Aaron knew. He knew I had feelings. He didn't know you did. Nora's smile turned wistful. I'm not sure you knew you did. That truth landed harder than anything else. She was right. I'd spent so long burying it under jokes and distance that I'd convinced myself the feelings were just a running gag, the kind of harmless flirtation that kept bachelor parties interesting and gave me something to fantasize about when I was alone. But it was never harmless, not to her. I wasted a decade, I said. You wasted a decade, she agreed. I just waded through one. She reached for the car door handle. Are you coming? There's a taco place 2 miles from here. I want to eat something before the adrenaline wears off, and I realize I just walked out of my brother's engagement party in front of the entire family. I was about to answer when the front door of the house slammed open behind us. Aaron stood on the porch, his tie already loosened, his face a storm of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. Liam, his voice cut through the quiet street. Get back here. We're doing this now, all 3 of us. Nora paused. She looked at me, then at her brother, and I saw something change in her posture, the same stillness I'd noticed when she set down her champagne glass, the stillness of a woman who was done waiting for permission. All 3 of us, she repeated. Then she shut the car door and started walking back toward the house. Fine, but I'm not coming alone. She glanced over her shoulder at me. You owe me this. Don't make me do it by myself. I followed her up the driveway, past the rose bushes, past the porch swing where I'd once told Aaron I thought his sister was pretty and he'd laughed and said, everyone does, but she's off limits, so don't even think about it. I'd laughed too, and the lie grew another ring around its core. Now the reckoning had arrived, and as I climbed the porch steps toward the best friend I'd ever had and the woman I'd loved in secret for half my life, I realized I had no idea what I was going to say. The house had emptied. The guests had been shuffled out with polite murmurs and unopened dessert boxes, leaving behind the kind of silence that fills a room after something irreversible has happened. The living room still smelled like champagne and candle wax, but all the warmth had drained away. Aaron stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, his tie hanging loose around his neck. Caitlin was in the corner, hands wrapped around a glass of water she wasn't drinking. She looked less angry than bewildered, like she'd just watched a car crash in slow motion and was still trying to identify the vehicles. Nora walked in first. She didn't hesitate. She never hesitated. She just moved to the center of the room and turned to face her brother like she'd been preparing for this conversation since she learned how to form words. I came in behind her, my heart hammering against my ribs. So, Aaron said. The word was flat, stripped of all the warmth we'd shared for nearly 20 years. My best man, my little sister, and a joke that apparently wasn't a joke at all. Someone want to explain. Nora opened her mouth, but I stepped forward. I owe you that much, I said. I've been in love with Nora since I was 17. I never said anything because I thought it would destroy our friendship, because you told me once that she was off limits and I believed you, so I turned it into a joke. A stupid, cowardly joke that I told for 10 years, hoping you'd never notice it wasn't funny to me. Aaron's jaw tightened. So instead of coming to me like a man, you came to my engagement party and humiliated me in front of my entire family. That's not what I intended. What you intended doesn't matter, he snapped. Do you have any idea what my parents are thinking right now? What Caitlin's parents are thinking? Her grandmother looked like she just swallowed a lemon. Then Nora stepped between us, not physically blocking but commanding the space. Stop it, Aaron. This isn't about you. The hell it's not. This is my engagement party, my house, my life, Nora interrupted. Her voice was quiet but sharp, the way steel sounds when it's drawn slowly from a sheath. You've been telling me what to do with it since I could walk. Don't go near my friends. Don't bother my teammates. Don't even think about the boys I bring home. You'll scare them all away and I'll have to clean up the mess. I've spent 26 years living by your rules, Aaron, and you know what they got me. A decade of waiting for a man you told me would never feel the same way. Aaron's expression flickered. The anger cracked just slightly, revealing something underneath. What are you talking about? Junior year of college, she said. I came to you and asked if you thought Liam could ever see me as more than your kid sister. Do you remember what you said? He didn't answer. The room had gone cold again, but this time the chill came from him. "You said not a chance. He's a flirt, Nora. He talks like that to everyone. Don't embarrass yourself." Her voice didn't waver. "You told me I was just a running joke to him, so I believed you. I buried it. I moved on. I dated other people. I even convinced myself I was happy for a while. But every time I saw Liam at a family gathering, every time he made one of those stupid jokes, it felt like a punch in the gut because all I could hear was your voice telling me I wasn't enough." I stared at Aaron, stunned. He'd never mentioned that conversation. In all the years we'd been friends, he'd never once said Nora had asked about me. I'd been living with the assumption that she was indifferent, that my jokes were harmless because she never responded. Now the silence I'd interpreted as disinterest was actually years of guarded pain. Aaron's face had gone pale. "I was trying to protect you." "No," Nora said, stepping closer. "You were trying to protect yourself. You didn't want things to get complicated between you and Liam. You didn't want to share him, and you definitely didn't want to think about your best friend and your sister in the same sentence unless it was a joke. So you lied to me, Aaron. You told me I had no chance when you'd never even asked him." Caitlin finally spoke from the corner, her voice small. "Aaron, is that true?" He didn't answer her either. For a long moment he just stood there, the weight of the accusation pressing down on him. Then he looked at me, really looked, and I saw something I'd never seen in his eyes before: shame. "I didn't know," he said, the words rough as gravel. "I didn't know you actually felt that way. I thought you were just being Liam. The guy who flirts with everyone. The guy who makes inappropriate comments and calls it charm. I never thought you were serious." "That's because you never asked," I said. The anger was finally rising in my own chest, a slow burn that had been smoldering for years without my realizing it. "You gave me a rule 10 years ago and I followed it like a loyal dog. No discussion, no questions. And you," I glanced at Nora, "you knew all along and said nothing." "I said something to him," Nora said, her voice gentler now. "I just never said it to you because he told me it was pointless, and after a while I started to believe it." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Caitlin set her water glass down and moved toward Aaron, placing a hand on his arm. "Maybe you should apologize," she murmured. Aaron pulled away, not aggressively but with a restless energy that filled the room. He paced to the window, then back, his fists clenched at his sides. "So what now? You two walk off into the sunset and I'm supposed to be happy about it. 10 years of friendship and I'm just the obstacle you had to overcome." "You're not an obstacle," I said. "You're my best friend. That's why this was impossible for me. I was trying to protect us, and I lost a decade in the process. You're not the villain, Aaron, but you're not exactly innocent either." He spun around and the anger was back, but it was desperate now, the anger of a man who knows he's cornered and doesn't want to admit defeat. "And what about my wedding? You're my best man. Am I supposed to stand at the altar and pretend everything's normal while my sister and my best friend are?" He couldn't even finish the sentence. Nora spoke up, her tone measured. "You're supposed to be happy for us, Aaron. That's what family does. That's what friends do. But you can't do that until you stop seeing me as your property and Liam as your sidekick." That was the line that broke through. Aaron's shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked not like the imposing big brother who'd punched bullies and protected everyone around him, but like a tired man who just realized he'd been fighting the wrong war. Caitlin stepped forward again, this time taking his hand firmly. "Maybe we should all sit down," she suggested, "and actually talk. No jokes, no anger, just talk." I looked at Nora. She looked at me. There was a tiny nod, the one that said we were in this together whatever came next. But before we could move toward the couch, the front door opened behind us and Mrs. Calloway stepped inside. She'd clearly been waiting on the porch, listening through the screen door, and from the look on her face, she'd heard everything. "He's not going to change overnight," she said, her voice heavy with the wisdom of someone who'd raised this family and knew its fault lines better than anyone. "But I think it's time someone told you all the story of how I met your father. Because if we're going to have this conversation, you should know it's not the first time a Calloway has had to choose between loyalty and love." Everyone froze. The air shifted, charged with new weight. I realized then that this night wasn't just about me and Nora. It was about something older, deeper, a pattern hidden in the walls of this house, waiting to be exposed. And suddenly I understood. Mrs. Calloway's story would either save everything or shatter it completely. Mrs. Calloway crossed the room with the quiet authority of someone who had raised 2 children, weathered 30 years of marriage, and understood that the loudest person in a room is rarely the one who should be speaking. She settled into the armchair by the fireplace and gestured for us all to sit. Aaron didn't move at first, but Caitlin gently pulled him toward the couch. Nora sat next to me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, and for the first time that night the space between us felt like an answer instead of a question. When I was 22, Mrs. Calloway began, I fell in love with my brother's best friend. She paused, letting that land. My brother David was a year older, protective, loyal, the kind of man who believed rules existed to keep people safe. So when I told him I had feelings for Michael Calloway, he didn't just say no. He threatened to walk out of my life entirely if I pursued it. Aaron's head snapped up. Wait, Dad was the best friend. He was. And David was my version of you, Aaron. He thought he was protecting me from heartbreak, from the mess of mixing friendship with family. But all he really did was force me to hide the truest thing I'd ever felt. For 3 years, Michael and I barely spoke. We smiled at family gatherings, we made small talk, we pretended the air between us wasn't electric. And then one night at my parents' anniversary dinner, Michael stood up in front of everyone and said, "I'm done pretending." She looked directly at Nora, then at me. He didn't make a joke out of it, he just told the truth. David stormed out. My parents panicked. And Michael turned to me and said, "I love you, and I'm not going to apologize for it anymore." That was the night everything changed. Aaron's voice was hoarse. "But David, did he ever forgive you? He didn't come to our wedding, didn't speak to me for 5 years. But when his own daughter was born, he looked at me across the hospital room and said, 'I finally understand. Love isn't a rule you enforce. It's a risk you take.'" She smiled, her eyes glistening. "He held my hand and asked me to be godmother. Sometimes the people we think we're protecting are just the ones we're too afraid to lose." The room felt smaller, charged with something ancient and tender. Caitlin was crying silently. Aaron stared at the floor, his knuckles white. Nora reached over and took my hand, her fingers warm and steady. It was the first time we'd touched deliberately, without pretense, and the world shifted a half step to the left. "You knew," I said to Mrs. Calloway, the realization dawning. "You knew about us all along." "I suspected," she admitted. A mother notices when her daughter looks at a man like he's the only light in a dark room. I also noticed when that man started making jokes he didn't mean. I kept hoping one of you would grow braver sooner. But I'm glad you finally found your anniversary dinner moment, even if it involved tacos. A sound escaped Aaron, half laugh, half sob. He lifted his head, and his face was raw, stripped of the anger that had armored him all night. "I kept telling myself I was protecting her," he said to me. "But I was really just protecting myself from having to share you, from having to look at my sister and see someone who mattered to you as much as I did." Nora squeezed my hand, then let go and crossed to her brother. She knelt in front of him, the same way she must have done when they were kids and he'd scraped a knee. "You're still my big brother. You always will be. But I'm not your property, Aaron. I never was. And the fact that you love us both should be a good thing, not a threat." He reached out and pulled her into a hug, burying his face in her shoulder. I heard him murmur something. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." And the last of the night's weight dissolved into salt water and relief. Caitlin put her hand on his back, her eyes meeting mine with a small, exhausted smile. Mrs. Calloway sat back in her chair, looking for all the world like a woman who had just completed a very long and very delicate piece of embroidery. Then Aaron pulled back, wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand. "I have something to show you," he said, his voice steadier now. He stood and walked to the hallway closet, the one where the family kept photo albums and old Christmas decorations and the detritus of 30 years. He came back carrying a small, faded envelope. Wordlessly, he handed it to Nora. She opened it and pulled out a photograph. I leaned over to see. It was from junior prom. There I was, 17 years old, in an ill-fitting tuxedo, dancing with Megan while she beamed up at me. And in the corner of the frame, blurred but unmistakable, was Nora. 15 years old, still in her volunteer t-shirt, standing by the punch bowl. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at me. The longing in her expression was so vivid, so unguarded, that it cracked something open in my chest. "I took that picture," Aaron said quietly. "I saw it even then, but I told myself it was a crush that would pass. I told myself I was doing the right thing by keeping you apart." He looked from Nora to me, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I was wrong, and I've known it for years, but I was too stubborn to admit it until tonight." Nora pressed the photo to her heart. "You've had this the whole time." "I've had it in that closet, waiting for the day one of you finally broke the silence. When you grabbed your coat and said, 'Finally,' I knew the waiting was over." He turned to me. "Liam, I've been a coward too, just a different kind. I should have trusted you both enough to make your own choices. Instead, I made myself the gatekeeper of something that was never mine to control." I stood up and walked over to him. For a moment we just looked at each other, two men who had been brothers since 7th grade, who had fought and lied and loved the same people and somehow, despite everything, still chose each other. Then I held out my hand. He took it, then pulled me into a brief, fierce hug. "Don't hurt her," he whispered. "I've spent 10 years hurting her by not saying anything. I'm done with that." When we separated, Nora was still holding the prom picture. She looked up at me, her eyes bright but unshattered. "I want a copy of this," she said, "framed, in our apartment someday, to remind us both how long a finally can take." I took her hand again, and this time there was no pretense in the room, no tension, no secret waiting to be discovered. Just the quiet miracle of a thing long buried finally seeing daylight. Caitlin raised her water glass. "I know this is a strange toast, considering my engagement party just turned into a family therapy session, but to finally." We all laughed, the kind of laughter that comes after tears, fragile and healing. Mrs. Calloway nodded at me, and in her eyes I saw the blessing I hadn't known I needed. The clock on the mantel struck 11, and I realized this night had reorganized my entire life in the space of a few hours. The love I'd hidden had turned out to be the only honest thing about me. And now, in front of the people who mattered most, I didn't have to hide anymore. The wedding was still months away. There would be conversations, awkward dinners, the slow rebuilding of trust. But standing in that living room holding Nora's hand, I understood that some risks aren't risks at all. They're just truths that took too long to arrive. And the only thing worse than waiting a decade would have been waiting 11 years. The thing about secrets is they don't stay buried, they just change shape. For 10 years, Liam turned love into a punchline. Nora turned hope into a waiting room. And Aaron, the best friend who should have been the bridge, turned protection into a prison. Not because anyone was evil, because fear is a quiet architect. It tells you that honesty will cost too much, that silence is safer, that the rules you inherit are rules you can't rewrite. But here's what that night proved. The rules had never been walls. They were just stories a family told itself to avoid the terrifying possibility that love might rearrange everything. And the wildest part. Once the truth was spoken, the room didn't collapse. It expanded. Old photographs came out of closets. Apologies replaced accusations. A mother told a story that had been waiting 30 years for the right ears. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't shout from a rooftop. It's quietly set down a champagne glass, look at the one you've been pretending not to love, and say, "Finally." So I want to ask you, have you ever dressed a real feeling up as a joke because the alternative felt like a grenade? Have you ever buried a truth so deep you forgot it was there until someone else dug it up? And what happened when the silence broke? Or what's still happening because it hasn't? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every one. And if this one resonated, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.